Hi, thanks for watching this seminar, which is one of 3 seminars for people on the waiting list for cognitive behaviour therapy. My name's Martin Groom. I'm a cognitive and behaviour therapist with the Leeds IAPT service, and I've been a cognitive behaviour therapist for about 10 years. Thinking about the aims of the seminars more generally, all 3 seminars are aimed to help people prepare for their CBT so that they can make the most of it when it comes around. A second general aim of the seminars is to support people while they wait for treatment. We do that in 2 ways. So the seminars aim to help people generally understand what sort of things keep anxiety, depression, the problem in general going, and if you understand it better, generally that will usually help you feel better or help you cope better. The second general aim of all the seminars is to give people some ideas or techniques, sometimes called change methods, to help them cope while they wait. And we'll be covering some specific change methods or treatment techniques in today's seminar. So thinking about the aims of today's seminar, which is called Manage Your Mind, what we're going to be looking at today is to begin to understand the cycles that keep worry going. Cycles in CBT are very important. This idea that generally what keeps things going is a circular process, sometimes called a vicious cycle. So if we can spot vicious cycles, you're more likely to understand your problem, and you're more likely to be able to think about what needs to change in order to start feeling better. So one aim is to begin to understand the cycles that keep worry going. And another aim is to introduce some ideas and methods to break out of these cycles. Generally, as we go through the seminar, I'd encourage you to not keep too many notes because all the seminars are supported by a self-help booklet which you'll be able to contact the service to get a hard copy of, or it may be downloadable from the website. This is likely to change over time, but if you look in the notes in the YouTube section for this clip, it'll give you some guidance about how to get hold of the booklet if you haven't already. The booklet takes you through and explains all the ideas in the seminar and gives you examples of all the change methods or treatment techniques that we use. We're going to cover quite a lot of ideas, and only some of them may be relevant to you. And these are the ones that you probably want to pick out. One of the ideas of the seminars isn't that every single bit is relevant to you. It's more like a smorgasbord, which is, I think, the Swedish word for a hotel breakfast. When you go down for breakfast in a hotel, there's kind of loads and loads of different things that you might eat for breakfast. Porridge, fried eggs, bacon, cereal. The idea is that you don't eat everything, but there's probably 1 or 2 things that you think is what you want on that day, or what you think fits with what you want. And that's kind of how to approach these seminars. Pick out the things which fit for you, and if there's 1 or 2 ideas, that might be the things that you want to focus on to work on as homework in between seminars. If you're thinking about the agenda for today's session, now the word agenda is something that you'll come across when you start your CBT. At the beginning of most sessions, your CBT therapist will say to you something like, what would you like to put on the agenda today? Now that might sound a bit business-like, but what we're trying to do is, in your 50 minutes or hour for your treatment, try to create a degree of focus, which is focused on what you'd like to get out of treatment and what your current concerns are. So when your therapist asks you what would you like to put on the agenda today, what they mean by that is there a problem that you've had from this week which is particularly relevant to discussing today? Is there something about your homework that you'd want to discuss today? Is there anything really which you're curious about the problem which might be useful for us to try to figure out or find something out about? So coming back to our agenda today, what we're going to be looking at is what do people worry about, and that'll take about 5 minutes. And then for about 20 to 30 minutes we're going to be looking at what is worry and anxiety. And then we'll also look at within that section some ideas or tips to how to cope with both those things, with anxiety and worry. And then the last bit of the agenda for today is looking at the processes that feed worry. attention, thinking, and some typical behaviours such as avoidance, which tend to feed back to worry to kind of make it worse or more intense. And after we've looked at understanding within each of those sections, we'll look at some tips and ideas to cope. So, looking at the first item of the agenda, what do people worry about? What do you worry about? So this might be a good time to just pause the clip now and write down a few tips on a bit of paper. Either what do people worry about, or perhaps what do you worry about, or what have you been worrying about over the last week? So there's an endless amount of the sorts of things people worry about. And what we generally call these in CBT is, in fact what most people call them, would be current concerns. So these are the sorts of things that we're concerned about, and we tend to worry about the things that we're concerned about. So if we've recently had some problem with our health, we're more likely to worry along the lines of our health. If we've currently got a money problem, we're more likely to be concerned and to worry about that as a current concern. So again, with the same list, we can call these, as much as we can call them worries, we can also call them current concerns. So generally people worry about their current concerns. But another question to ask is, what is worry? We worry about stuff, but what is worry? So again, what I encourage you to do is just pause the clip for a sec, get out a pen and paper, and just write down a few ideas about what you think worry is. Okay, so when we're doing the seminar in a group, people come up with all sorts of really useful ideas, and generally they're pretty similar to these ones, which goes something like this. Worry is a thinking activity. It's something that we do. It's almost like a behaviour. We don't do it with our arms and legs, so it's not something that you can see so much, but nevertheless it's a thinking activity. It's something that we actively do. Worry tends to be about the future, and it has this habit of making us anxious. And it's often about trying to be more certain about the future by thinking of as many possibilities as we can. So if we say worrying about our health, worry will tend to think about all the awful things that might be wrong with us. So we might start, say, worrying about a stomach pain might jump from being appendicitis to perhaps cancer. Or if we're worrying about money, we might start jumping ahead into the future to start thinking about losing our houses or having our car taken away. So worrying is trying to be more certain about the future by thinking about all the different possibilities there are and thinking about as many possibilities as we can. Now, worry is also a normal process and can be helpful sometimes. Worry is very normal if we're in the middle of a period which is tough or difficult, for example, when we have something wrong with us. So what generally helps worry to become a helpful behaviour is if we can and do something about it. So for example, if we do find ourselves worrying about money, and one of the things that we could do is perhaps look at our finances and pay some bills, then that might be useful. If we're worrying about our health, it might be useful to ask ourselves, do I need to lose a bit of weight, or do I need to go and see my GP? So worry is generally thought to be useful if it motivates us to take an action which is relevant. So here we have then a kind of a definition about what worry is. Now, dwelling and rumination are very similar to worry. But just before I give my understanding about what dwelling and rumination is, again, let's pause for a moment and, using your pen and paper, just take a few minutes to jot down what you think dwelling and rumination are. Dwelling and rumination. So these are similar to worry, and sometimes they're referred to as worry's cousin. So, like worry, dwelling and rumination are thinking activities. It's something that we do kind of inside our heads rather than with our arms and legs. But rather than when worry is a future-focused thinking activity, dwelling tends to be past-focused. It's often about something that's happened in the past, something that's occurred that we tend to go over and over. Often people talk about circular thinking patterns like, why me? Or if only I'd. Another example, often of a self-critical or angry flavour, is, why did I do that? Or I shouldn't have done that. To give an example from my own life, often say if I'm cutting the lawn, if there's something that's happened at work that I found difficult or frustrating, I might find myself, without really noticing at first, that actually I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, why did I say that, or I shouldn't have done that, or perhaps they shouldn't be doing this, or if only the management team could do something differently, something like that. And these are very common patterns of thinking activity, which we generally call dwelling and rumination. So if we start to look at this as a cycle, so far what we've looked at is, we've looked at what worry is, and one of the things that worry is something that leads to anxiety. So when we worry, we're often thinking about the future, we're usually thinking about something that feels quite threatening, and as a consequence we start to feel quite anxious. And when we get anxious, what happens to our levels of worry? Well, we tend to worry more, and more worry leads to more anxiety. So what we end up is this vicious cycle where we're worrying more, we're getting more anxious, and things start to sort of spiral. So where worry tends to have a sort of an emotional flavour of anxiety, dwelling tends to have a different emotional tone. If we've, say, been dwelling about things in the past or thinking about a mistake that we think we've made, we're more likely to feel, we may feel anxious, but we may also feel guilty, ashamed, low, or angry. And similarly, as we start to feel guilty or ashamed or low, we'll tend to dwell even more, and as we dwell even more, the feelings start to mount. So again, we're into a kind of a vicious cycle which keeps us stuck. So far we've talked about dwelling and worry quite a lot, and we've defined these as a thinking activity that leads to anxiety and other unwanted feelings. But let's pause for a moment and let's have a think about what is anxiety. So once again, if you take your pen and paper and just scribble down some ideas what you think anxiety is. Okay, so common things that people will jot down on their list when thinking about what anxiety is, probably something like this. So anxiety is fear. Fear is anxiety. Sometimes people refer to it as stress, but it's pretty much all the same thing. What anxiety is fear. And it's a normal, healthy feeling we have when our bodies produce adrenaline and other chemicals to prepare us to deal with threat or danger. So all the time our thinking minds, the part of our mind which does dwelling and worry, is trying to calculate how much threat or danger a current concern or situation represents. And if we think it is dangerous or threatening to us, for example, if we're worrying that we're losing control, or worrying that we're ill, or worrying that we haven't got enough money to pay bills, we'll tend to think that we're in danger, and our bodies will start to produce adrenaline and other chemicals to prepare us to deal with that threat. So anxiety is fear. Anxiety is a normal and healthy reaction we have that involves adrenaline and other chemicals to prepare us to deal with threat. and it's often referred to as a fight and flight system. So it's almost as if we've got two parts of our brain which are responsible for anxiety. One is a thinking, reasoning part of our brain, and that does worry and imagination and dwelling. And there's another part of our brain which is more physical, which generates chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol, which leads to emotions, but also manages all the physical functions of our body without us having to think about it at all. The fight and flight system is a very automatic system which we can't really control that much. Let's look at that in terms of our brain. So here's a diagram of a brain. Don't worry too much about the bits of writing around it, but you can see that the brain here is divided into the yellow and the pink. Now the outside, you've got the cortical brain, or the thinking part of the brain. This is the sort of brain that you might see in jars, in documentaries or in films. And this is the part of the brain which kind of makes us uniquely human. And this is the part of the brain that does the thinking, the reasoning, the imagining. And in the middle, you've got the old brain, sometimes called the limbic system or the limbic cortex. Now this brain's been around a lot longer than the new brain or the thinking brain. Now the pink bit, or the limbic system, this is the bit that's responsible for the fight and flight symptoms that we were talking about previously. This is the bit that is responsible for sending and generating the chemicals such as adrenaline and cortisol that makes us feel anxious. Now this old part of the brain, the limbic system, is very, very fast, and in fact it's faster than the thinking part of the brain, the yellow bit, and it's also hardwired directly into our attention and our perception. And what I mean by that is it's hardwired directly into hearing and vision. Now, because it's so fast and because it's directly linked into vision and hearing, it usually detects a threat quicker than the thinking part of the brain. So, for example, if we're walking through a wood and we see a twig which looks somewhat like a snake, sometimes our fight and flight system can be activated very quickly and we become very, very anxious before the thinking part of the brain can catch up and think, hang on a sec, that's a twig, that's not a snake. And one thing to notice about that scenario is that even after our thinking part of the brain has caught up with us and we're rationally telling ourselves that it's a stick, we're still going to feel very anxious because those chemicals that have been released by the fight and flight system are still knocking around in our bodies, and we can't just get rid of them straight away. So we're still likely to feel quite wired and anxious even when our thinking brain has worked out that actually there's no danger in a situation at all. Another thing to take from this diagram is that the old brain, the limbic system, is connected not just to our vision and to our hearing, it's also connected to our thinking part of our brain. So when we start worrying or about the future or dwelling about the past, the limbic system isn't very good at telling the difference between a thought about something happening and something happening. So if we're worrying that we're going to get into trouble with money, or if we're worrying that we're losing control, or if we're worrying about a health concern, the limbic system will start to behave as if that is happening and will start to give us adrenaline and cortisol to make us feel very anxious. So, once again, worry leads to anxiety, and anxiety can lead to worry, and this is part of a normal process of how our brains are built, because our old brain, the thinking part of the brain, is directly tied into the old part of the brain which generates anxiety feelings. So in summary then, what we've talked about so far about is what worry is. Worry is a thinking activity, it's something that we do. It's nearly always about the future, and it nearly always makes us feel anxious. And then once we get anxious, we're more likely to worry more, and so the cycle continues. So what we're going to move on to next is is some change methods or some techniques to help you cope, to help you break out of this cycle, which is kind of what CBT is all about. It's about this process of working out these vicious cycles, understanding them, and then coming up with a change method, something to experiment with to see if it makes things better, to see if it breaks you out of this cycle. So first, let's look at some tips to cope directly with anxiety or feeling stressed. We're going to focus on ones which deal more directly with the anxiety and the feelings of anxiety themselves, rather than the thinking side of things first. Now, you may be very familiar with some of these ideas, and if that's the case, then that's really great. But another question you might ask is, even though I understand and know this, am I doing this at the moment? Am I perhaps doing it enough? So let's look at the list and see if it's similar to sort of thoughts you have about what you already do to cope with anxiety. One thing that you can do is, based on the sort of knowledge in the self-help booklet and what we've been talking about so far in the seminar, is if you notice yourself feeling very anxious, or indeed if you're feeling worried, is remind yourself that this is a healthy, normal process. Now, one idea is it's a bit like thinking that anxiety is man's best friend. So man's best friend is a term often used when we talk about dogs. Now, not everybody likes dogs, but stereotypically there's this idea that in some ways a dog is man's best friend. It's this faithful hound that guards us, that can provide comfort, that gives us something to stroke. But if we think about a dog in a different way, if we think about a dog as if it's something threatening or snarling or dangerous, thinking about a dog in that way can in itself make us feel very anxious. So if we try to think about anxiety as a healthy, normal process, something which is evidence that we've detected a threat and that actually our brain is working very normally, it's releasing anxiety, it's releasing adrenaline or cortisol to help us cope with a dangerous situation, then that might be a more helpful way to think about it. Another top tip or useful way of dealing with anxiety and feeling stress is exercise. All the research demonstrates that exercise is very useful in terms of lowering our anxiety and bringing up feelings of contentment or calmness. Once we've been worrying and the adrenaline or cortisol is released into our system, by exercising we use up this extra energy and that kind of buzzy, wired feeling. But we also release other chemicals which are the ones which help us feel calm. These are dopamine and serotonin. And serotonin is one of the chemicals which antidepressants tend to lock into our minds, lock into our brains to help us feeling more balanced and more level. So exercise is a really good way of coping with anxiety and bringing your level of anxiety back down. Often we'll think about things and worry less if we've been to the gym or been for a run or been for a walk or done some gardening. Anything really that's going to increase our heartbeat substantially for about 20 minutes or so. Now, the third tip about coping with anxiety is to try to do what matters to you in spite of worry and anxiety, and perhaps to face up to problems. Now, very understandably, when we're feeling worried and anxious, one of the things that humans tend to do is we tend to withdraw or do less of what matters. Perhaps we start to get ideas like, well, it's not worth doing that because I won't enjoy it so much, or I'll be too worried to enjoy it. We may have a problem which needs solving, like maybe speaking to someone about something that's going on in a relationship, or speaking to the bank about solving a financial problem. But very understandably, as we approach that problem, it makes us even more anxious and we tend to avoid it. Now, that in turn can have the unintended consequence of making us worried more or making the problem last over a longer period. So trying to do more of what matters or keep up what matters and trying to face up with problems, although in the short term might make us feel more anxious, is in the longer term is more likely to help us feel less anxious and worry less. Now, I'm not saying that that's an easy thing to do, and it might be one of the most difficult things you do, but it is likely to help you feel better in the medium to longer term. Having adrenaline and cortisol in your system is encouraging you to speed up. And once we speed up, we end up rushing, and once we rush, we can end up making mistakes and generally feeling more and more wired. Now, we can get better at noticing this process of feeling stressed and anxious and speeding up, and when we do that, when we notice it, we can consciously try to slow down. Now again, this isn't easy when the chemicals of adrenaline and cortisol, the chemicals of anxiety in your body, but it's something through effortful practice can help you to calm down and feel less anxious and stressed by effortfully practicing slowing down. So just before we move on to some ideas to see more how we cope with worry and dwelling, these thinking activities that lead to anxiety, in summary, what we've just looked at now is 4 main ways of coping with anxiety and stress. Reminding yourself that it's a healthy process, it's something that can be understood. Trying to exercise more, trying not to put things off too much, and trying to notice when you rush and trying to slow down. So, moving on now to look at a technique called the 2-minute rule, which is more aimed at, rather than focusing directly on the anxiety, more aimed at trying to spend less time dwelling, ruminating or worrying. So we talked earlier about how worry and dwelling are thinking behaviours, and if they're behaviours, this sort of implies that they're controllable, or at least we have some control of them over these processes if we can notice that we're doing them. So this technique called the 2-minute rule is aimed to help you notice more when you're worrying or dwelling, and to try to nip it in the bud and get back out of your head and back into your life. Now, details of this are in your booklet, but here's a brief outline now. This is how it works. So the 2-minute rule goes a bit like this. Try to notice when you're dwelling or worrying. Now, you might be in the middle of dwelling or worrying before you notice it, but as soon as you do notice it, or you move on to step 2. Rather than trying to stop or trying to distract yourself or busy yourself, rather than stop, deliberately carry on for 2 minutes. Okay, this might seem a rather strange thing to do, but the best thing to do is just to try this and see if it works. Now, a good way to carry on for 2 minutes is to look at your watch, or look at the clock in the kitchen, or even ideally to set a bleep on your phone or your watch to go off in 2 minutes time. So when you notice you're worrying or dwelling, rather than stop, deliberately allow yourself to carry on for 2 minutes. When the 2 minutes is up, when the bleep's gone off, move on to step 3. Ask yourself, as part of step 3, has this helped solve or understand the problem? So has worrying or dwelling on this problem helped me solve it or understand the problem better? The next question is, do I feel better? So, has worrying or dwelling helped me feel any better? After you've answered those questions, the answer may be yes or it may be no. It's more likely to be no. Is actively choose either to carry on dwelling or worrying, or to get on with something that matters to you. Now, worrying and dwelling can very often happen when you're already doing something that matters to you. For example, you might be mowing the lawn, or you might be at work, you might be doing something like washing up or watching a movie. In which case, the idea is, rather than switching or changing activities, you carry on doing what you were doing before, but try to switch your attention away from what's been going on in your head, back to the task that you were doing. So if you're washing up or you're doing a task in the kitchen, try to focus really on that task. And similarly, if you're at work or you're talking to someone, try to switch your attention away from the thoughts and kind of out of your head toward what you're doing. With all these techniques, especially with the 2-minute rule, this is something that you want to try at least 2 or 3 times. The rule, sometimes we call this the rule of 3. To do it 3 times and see whether it works. And by works, we mean, does it help you to get back out of your head and back on with your life? Or does it help you reduce dwelling and worrying, or just cope with it a bit better? Okay, so what we've talked about so far reflects our agenda. So we've spent 5 minutes talking about what sort of things people worry about. And then we've moved on to look about what is worry and anxiety, and some ideas and tips to cope. So we're moving into the last stage of the agenda, the third bit, which is some of the processes or the other processes that feed worry, and some tips and ideas to cope. And that's what we're going to move on to for the second half of this seminar. So in summary then, we've been looking at how worry tends to lead to anxiety, and anxiety leads to worry, which is something which you're probably already very familiar with and how that feels. If we open that up a bit further and take that a step further, here's a diagram which in CBT we sometimes call a formulation or a conceptualization. And here we see in the middle we've put worry and dwelling. So that process of worry leading to anxiety, or dwelling leading to shame or anger or guilt, that's still going on in the middle. But now there's 3 other petals on the outside of that. And sometimes this is called a vicious flower formulation. Now this is a very general formulation. So we're talking generally about what sorts of things keep worry and dwelling going for people. So we've got thinking, attention, and avoidance. But if this was your CBD, or this was your formulation, rather than being general ideas, these would be your sorts of thinking patterns, the sorts of things you attend to, or the sorts of things you avoid. So it'd be very personal and very specific to the sorts of things that you've worked at with your cognitive behaviour therapist in the assessment stage. So coming back to this diagram, this is a diagram to help us understand what sorts of things feed into worry and dwelling to keep it going. So, for example, when we worry, we start to think differently, and when we start to think differently, we start to worry more. When we're worried or we're dwelling, our attention starts to change, and when our attention starts to change, we tend to dwell or worry more. And similarly, when we worry or dwell, we're much more likely to avoid or put things off, which in turn helps us, or unhelpfully leads to more worry or dwelling. So for the rest of this seminar, we're going to break it down into these 3 vicious cycles and look at them in a bit more detail, starting in the first instance with attention. And here's the cycle on its own, where we're saying that worry and dwelling leads to attention, and attention leads to worry and dwelling. Next thing to do then is I'd like to look at this video, which is an awareness test. It's not a trick, there's no hocus pocus about it. I'd just like to watch the video and then we'll discuss it afterwards.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Okay, so if you've watched the clip, the chances are that what you notice is the first time the clip was played is you saw a lot of white team passes, and you may have even seen, the right amount of white team passes, say about 12 or 13. But the first time you watched it, you probably didn't see the moonwalking bear. The second time the clip was played, you probably did see the moonwalking bear, or it may have taken a couple of times for you to see it. So let's think about what's the difference between those two clips, and what is it about the two experiences that means in one version you notice white team passes, when in the second version you're more likely to notice the moonwalking bear. And we'll go on to think about how is this relevant to understanding worry. Now, in the first part of the seminar we talked about what sort of things people worry about, and we called these current concerns. So what was going on in the video is the clip was manipulating or changing your current concern. First, it directed your current concern to look out for white team passes, and you saw a lot of white team passes. But then after that, the current concern was changed and your attention followed, and you probably soon or saw the moonwalking bear. So let's look at how this works in terms of driving or fueling worry and dwelling. So if we're worrying about this, that list that we generated in the first, earlier on in the seminar, say if we're worrying about our health or what we've just said or anything really, we're much more likely to notice things which are to do with that. And if we're more likely to notice things that are to do with that, it's more likely to lead to worry. Now, part of the reason for that is because when we notice things which fit with our current concern, it can give the impression that there's more of it than there was before. Now, this doesn't just happen with worry. This is a very normal and helpful process that happens throughout life. So, for example, if you've ever had the experience of looking for somewhere to live, looking out for a new flat to let or a room to let, or perhaps a house to buy, when you were walking around town or driving around town, before you decided to look for somewhere to live in that area, you probably didn't notice any of the to let signs or for sale signs at all. But as soon as your current concern switches to looking out for somewhere to live, you start to notice signs without thinking about it at all. And it can give the impression that there's more of them. Similarly, say for example, if you were thinking about going to a wedding or a birthday party and you've got your eye on a particular outfit or dress that you've seen in a magazine or on the internet, you might think it's a really great idea to buy it, but then because you've been thinking about that, because that's been a current concern, suddenly you start to notice that actually a lot of people are wearing this dress already, and maybe you change your mind. So this is a normal process of when our current concern changes, what we notice changes as well. And with worry, this can lead to more worry. So let's take that a step further. In that when we're worrying about something and we're noticing more of the things that fit with our worry, what we also miss is other things that are going on. And once again, that can give the impression that there's more danger or more concerns than there was before. Okay, so if we're worrying about something, we're more likely to notice more of the things that we're worrying about. But also, if we're worrying about something, we're more likely to miss some of the things that are likely to maybe make us feel better. We call this attentional bias. So what we're going to look at next is some common attention biases that often we look at in cognitive behaviour therapy. Now, one very common attentional bias is when we're concerned about having a panic attack, or generally getting very anxious, or we're concerned about our health or something wrong with our health. What sort of things might we be biased to? What might we look out for? And maybe without even knowing it, if we're worrying about having a panic attack or worried about our health, well, generally more of our attention is likely to be on our body symptoms and features. So perhaps as we start to get more anxious, we might notice that our heart is beating a bit faster, and then our attention then moves toward our heart while we start to miss out on all the other things that are going around outside our bodies. This can give the impression that maybe our heart's beating faster than it is, or harder than it is, and then we start to worry about that more, and that can sometimes lead to a panic attack. So if instead our concern maybe is about what others think of us, or we're overly concerned about what others think of us, again, this is a really common attentional bias that we come across in CBT. Problems like social anxiety or performance anxiety, perhaps you're worried about giving a presentation at work, or get very anxious when talking to people in groups or in conversation. If that's the case, then our attention is more likely to be on aspects of us that we think others will notice and perhaps judge harshly. We may also have our attention more likely to be on signs that others have noticed those things, or signs that they're being critical of us. And this in turn can make us more worried or more anxious. Finally, another typical way that we can experience an attentional bias as a person, and very commonly worked on in CBT, is we might have very high standards, sometimes called perfectionism. Now, if our concern is about maintaining high standards, or maintaining sort of an unrealistic high standard, then more of our attention might be on our mistakes, on our errors or our flaws. Now, this in turn can make us more likely to notice mistakes, more likely to notice errors or flaws, which in turn makes us worry more, and perhaps might actually lead to making a mistake, or just making us feel very uncomfortable or anxious. So attentional biases are very common, and if we understand them more, this is one of the ways that it can make us less worried and make the whole thing more understandable. So let's look a little bit more in detail about how this works. So this is a slightly more detailed vicious cycle, again focusing on this instance about having a panic attack. So let's say if we're more vulnerable, or we have been worrying about having a panic attack for a while, and then generally during the day we're very likely at some stage to feel quite anxious. When we get anxious, our attention changes and we start to become focused on symptoms like heart or breathing or dizziness. It can seem like the symptoms are more intense or frequent, and this can lead to more symptoms, which is very normal. We then start to worrying about having a panic attack, we produce more anxiety, and so the cycle deepens and deepens, and we become more and more anxious, and we may have a panic attack. Here's another example. If our worries about being noticed or being judged harshly, say in a supermarket, when we go into the supermarket, inevitably we start to feel a little bit more anxious. Our attention then starts to change and we become very inward focused. We're more likely to notice the sort of me type thoughts or what we're thinking about. Because we're more self-conscious, we're less likely to notice that actually the thing we're worried about, say being looked at or judged harshly by other people, isn't going on at all. In fact, we're less likely to notice that actually people are going about their business and aren't really concerned about us at all. So that combination of becoming very self-conscious and not noticing what's going on around us means that we carry on worrying about being noticed, or we may even worry more, we get more anxious, and so the cycle deepens. So for this next piece then, we've looked at so far about how attentional biases can make worry worse and how understandable it is. So I'd like to pause for a moment again, and maybe with your pencil and paper or your pen and paper, think about for you, when you're worrying about whatever it is you've worried about today, or what you've been worrying about this week, or generally the sort of thing that bothers you or you're worrying about that you want to work on in treatment, what do you tend to notice and what do you tend to miss? Or rather, what do you tend to notice more of and what perhaps do you miss? And try to make a note of that now before we move on to the next section. Okay, so that process of trying to reflect on your experience, trying to notice what you tend to notice more of when you're anxious and worried, and what sort of things you miss, is in itself something that you might find useful and part of your recovery or part of your CBT, to generally start to become more aware of the sorts of things that you or your mind does. So let's move on now then to taking that a step further. I'm going to introduce you to a change method called attention training. There's lots of different forms of attention training. We're going to concentrate on a quite simple one, and the method's outlined in the booklet that I discussed earlier on. But it goes something like this. So there are 3 places your attention can be. Now, knowing this can be useful because it means that any time you can stop and you can ask yourself where your attention is. So, for example, for me, making this video, about 85% of my attention is on the task of making the video. But I'm also aware that some of my attention is on me. So I'm still aware of the sort of rim around my glasses, and I can see that. I'm aware that I've got a slightly achy pain in my knees because I hurt my knee last night when I was running. So even though 85% of my attention is on task, say 5 or 6% is on me, sort of how I'm thinking and how I'm feeling. And now, especially as I think about it, I'm also aware, say 5% of my attention is on the noises of the traffic outside and the bright lights in the room. So what I've done there is I've stopped and I've asked myself, where is my attention? And I've found that most of my attention is on the task. Now, generally, that's where we want our attention to be. Now, what happens when we're worrying is the vast majority of our attention tends to shift away from task and away from the environment toward us or me. So when you've checked in with your attention, you may find that your attention is biased more towards you. So for example, 60, 70, 80% of your attention may be on your thoughts or your feelings or your worry, basically. Where that's only leaving, say, 10% of your attention on the environment or on the task. Now, let's say if you're out for a walk with the family, or you're out in the countryside, or if you're just walking on the road, you probably want most of your attention to be on the environment, either from enjoyment or for safety reasons, or on the task of getting from A to B. Or say, if you're in a conversation with someone, you probably want most of your attention to be on the task, that is, of having a conversation. So the way attention training works is, firstly, to try to get in the habit of checking in with yourself, especially if you're feeling a bit anxious or a bit worried, to ask yourself, where is my attention? And if you come up with a number where most of your attention has gone on to you, perhaps you're feeling self-conscious, or most of your attention is on your worry, try to actively place your attention back to task. One way that you can do this, or to help with this, is to put some post-it notes or maybe pieces of blue tack or anything really to remind you around your home, or perhaps in your office space or by your desk, little prompts to trigger this process of saying, where is my attention? And try to get in the habit first of just noticing where your attention is, and then secondly, trying to shift your attention back to where you want it to be. So if you're out on a walk, you want to focus on the nice colour of the leaves or the nice smell of the world outside. Or if you're on a task, like you're trying to do something for work, actively trying to shift your attention away from your mind and toward the task. Now, attention is like a muscle. If you're not used to doing this, at first you might find it difficult even to know where this muscle is. But through effortful practice, this should get easier and easier, both to notice where your attention is and to bring it back. But it does take practice. And the task is spelt out and laid out inside the self-help booklet that I talked about earlier on. Okay, so in summary then, what we've been looking at in this section again is how worrying and dwelling can be influenced by our attention. So just like with the white team passes and the moonwalking bears, when our current concern is about the thing we're worrying about, we're much more likely to attend to it, and when we attend to it, we're more likely to notice things which fit with it. which in turn can give a biased impression of the world and lead to more worry. And just like in the next section, we're not aware that this process is going on. So while we think that we perceive the world in a fair and equal way, without even realising it, all the time we're walking around with a very biased perception or a biased attention of how the world really is. And knowing that can be helpful because it can help us to understand why we're worrying so much and help put things in context. So let's go back to the big picture. We've been looking at this thing that we've called a vicious flower or a formulation. We started off understanding what worry is and how it links in with anxiety and other unwanted feelings. And we've moved on then to look at how attention can make that process even worse. But through a technique of attention training, we can get better at noticing when our attention has become, say, more self-focused, more focused on our worries, and get better at shifting our attention back to where we want it to be, very often on the task or on the environment. In that way, we're kind of compensating for this bias that all human minds tend to have when we have a current concern. So the next petal on the vicious flower that we're going to look at next is the thinking petal. What I'd like to look at next is a short clip, which then we'll talk about afterwards.
An event, seen from one point of view, gives one impression. Seen from another point of view, it gives quite a different impression. But it's only when you get the whole picture you can fully understand what's going on.
In the clip, we saw and the commentaries about a point of view, and we saw things from a different point of view. And from the early point of view, you might have thought, for example, that the man was running away from the car. And from the second point of view, you might have thought something like he was attacking the man or he was mugging the man. But in the third point of view, when we sort of got the big picture, you may have thought that he was rescuing him. Now, this term point of view is really interesting, and it's one that we often use not just to talk literally about a point of view, but it's actually how we think about things. So very often when we're talking about how we think about things, we talk about a point of view. And our point of view in this respect, how we think about a situation, can really influence how much we worry about it or how we feel about it. And that's what we're going to talk about next, which is how thinking or reasoning biases, or sometimes called thinking patterns, can influence how we feel and can influence how much we worry or dwell on a situation. Now, one commonly used example of this is if you think about if you're walking along the road and you saw someone that you knew on the other side of the road, and you say lifted a hand or nodded a head or even said something to kind of say hi to them, but rather than acknowledging you, they walk straight past. What sort of things would jump to your mind about what just happened there? And again, just take a moment maybe just to scribble a few things down. Now, from when we do this seminar in a group, common sorts of ideas, thoughts that people have about what's happened are things like, well, they're rude, they're stressed, I must have done something wrong, things like that. So the first thing to notice is different people think differently about the same situation, and similarly the same person can think differently about the same situation. Now, if we thought from the point of view that perhaps they were too busy or had something else on their mind that day, what effect would that have on how we felt? It may mean that we don't really feel bad about it at all, we don't get anxious or worried. However, if we think something like they're doing this deliberately, or they're stupid, or they're arrogant, how might that make us feel? We might start to feel angry. We might start dwelling on it. We might start thinking about it for the rest of the day. We might even start worrying about what we'd said in the past. So the point here is that our thinking biases our perception of what's really going on. It's a biased point of view, and it's not usually very accurate. Knowing this can help us step back from our thoughts, rather like we saw in the clip, and try to get the big picture of what's going on. And that's one of the things that you'll do a lot of in your cognitive behaviour therapy, is trying to learn how to, and in being encouraged by your therapist, to step back from your thoughts, to write your thoughts down and consider what effect that point of view is having on how you feel and how you behave. To consider other points of view, other ways of thinking about the same situation, and sort of try them on for size. So we, as humans, we tend to assume that we see the world just as it is. But actually we don't. None of us do, and that's completely normal. We tend to interpret the world through our thoughts, our thinking patterns, our point of view. And we tend to interpret the world along the lines of our current concerns. That thing we talked about right early in the seminar when we were talking about what sorts of things we're worrying about. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through some very common and unhelpful thinking patterns that most of us have at some point. And the first one we're going to look at is catastrophizing. Now, catastrophizing is where everything seems to be blown out of proportion and seems to end up in a catastrophe. So, for example, your partner's late home from work, will catastrophize and think that they've had an accident. Or, say, a relationship you're in ends, and we'll have the thought, the kind of point of view, if you like, that I can't live without them. I'll never find anyone else. I'll never get married. So a setback becomes a kind of a never-ending pattern or a defeat. So catastrophizing, really common thinking pattern or point of view that can make us feel more anxious and lead to a kind of a worry period. Another really common thinking pattern, which again most of us do at some point, it's completely normal, is personalizing. So this is where we tend to take personal responsibility for something that really isn't our fault or may not be a fault. So for example, if you're working in a team and the project goes wrong, we'll tend to think that it's all our fault. Or if a partner's in a bad mood or a friend's in a bad mood, we might have the thought, I must have done something wrong. So again, that's likely to change our mood, and once we get in a bad mood, we're more likely to either worry or dwell, and then we can get stuck in a cycle. Mind reading and jumping to conclusions are two kind of different thinking patterns, but very often they happen together. So we tend to jump to a conclusion that we think we know what other people are thinking, and we make an assumption. So for example, when a friend ignores you in the street, we might jump to the conclusion that they don't like us anymore. Or if a shop assistant in an expensive shop looks at you, we might think that they're thinking, she can't afford the clothes in here, she shouldn't be in here. Very common type of thinking pattern that shows up in social anxiety, or often when we get depressed, this thinking pattern tends to become more prominent. We tend to end up worrying more about what other people think about us, even though there may not be any evidence for it at all. Now, disqualifying the positive, again, is a very common one that comes up generally for people, but is more likely to happen once we start getting low. We tend to focus on the negative and ignore or disregard the positive. We tend to focus more on our weaknesses and forget our strengths. You might notice this is a kind of a British thing. So when someone compliments you, say on your outfit, you're more down to put it down to something external from you. So, this old thing, or it only cost me, or I found it in a charity shop. So kind of discounting the positive feedback. And you may notice that you feel quite uncomfortable when someone gives you a compliment. If that happens, it may well be that the reason this is happening is because this disqualifying the positive thinking pattern has happened, and you're seeing what's going on from this point of view. Now, emotional reasoning is a thinking pattern which is really common and happens to us all. And it goes like this. Now, if we're anxious, we tend to think we're in danger. Or if we're angry, we tend to think that someone else has done something wrong against us. Or if we're feeling guilty, that we must have done something wrong. And it can feel very true. In fact, we'll often jump to the conclusion that it is true. Hence why this is like a quite a dangerous or unhelpful point of view if we can't spot it. And that's called emotional reasoning. Couple more. So all or nothing types of thinking. Now this is when things are either one way or they're the other. There's no kind of middle ground. So if you make one little mistake, the whole thing is seen as a failure. And this is often the basis for having unrealistic standards, sometimes called perfectionism. So for example, if you were starting your CBT and if one session didn't go well, you might start to think that the whole thing was going to be a complete failure or it wasn't worth continuing. And if that does happen, that might be the sort of thing that it would be really worthwhile sharing with your therapist rather than keeping to yourself. Now, as we move to the end of these thinking patterns, then overgeneralizing. So this might show up that we might apply bad luck in one situation to all the time. We might start using language like always or never. So for example, you might be overgeneralizing if you're saying something like, or thinking something like, I'll never get a job. Or if you ask someone out on a date and they say no, you might start thinking, I'll never find another partner ever again. So going from the smallest amount of evidence, we come to a very broad general conclusion. Now, these thinking patterns, or sometimes called thinking biases, just like when we were looking at attention, we call those attention biases, are a real big focus of cognitive behaviour therapy. And being able to spot these is a really big part of CBT. But the process of being biased in our thinking is very normal, and we all do it most of the time. In fact, it's very unusual for anybody to walk around seeing things or thinking about things 2020. Now, it's thought that also this is a very useful process for us as a human race. Now, that might sound strange, but if you think about it, thinking in a kind of extra cautious or thinking that there's actually more danger than there really is in some ways more useful than thinking that there's less danger than there really is. So if we think about how we were evolved as cavemen, from cavemen or cave women, if we were to go out and see a bush but catastrophically jump to a conclusion that it was a bear, what we'd probably do is feel very anxious, our fight and flight systems would kick in and we'll run away. Now, even though 99% of the time the bush was probably a bush and not a bear, as a species, if we've run away more often than not, it means that our genes are going to be the ones that have gone forward to survive and become the human beings of today. So it's thought that biased thinking, exaggerated thinking, thinking of things in a point of view which sort of seems to exaggerate danger, even though it makes us feel stressed and leads to more worry, as a species may have been very helpful for us to carry on evolving. So unhelpful thought patterns tend to overestimate the amount of threat that there is. Now, although this is understandable and is very natural and may be useful for us as a species, let's just look for a minute about why this can be so harmful or why it can make us feel so anxious. So if we look at this equation, anxiety is pretty much the same as this equation of how much danger we think we're in divided by how well we think we can cope. So if we're in a situation and we start to catastrophize or jump to a conclusion, this starts to load the equation, so the amount of anxiety that we get is much greater than if we didn't. So if we start in a social situation, start thinking that not only are people noticing us because we've kind of jump to a conclusion or mind reading that people have noticed us, but also that people are thinking badly of us, that's going to make us feel more anxious. But also, if we start having a thinking bias about how well we can cope, so for example, if they do think badly of us, that's the end of the world, or I'll never be able to come here again, or I'll have to leave town, then that cranks the anxiety up even more. So thinking biases by this equation tend to really ramp up the amount of anxiety we experience, and therefore the amount of worry that we're more likely to lead to. So now we understand a little bit more about how thinking can influence worry. Let's look at some tips to cope. So some things that you might be able to do straight away to maybe start managing this better. And again, they're all outlined in the booklet which comes with this seminar. So maybe the first tip is to, thinking about the knowledge that we've just gone through, is to try to understand and accept that this is what minds do. Human minds aren't like computers. They are influenced by these biases, these attentional biases, and these thinking biases, and there's nothing really that we can do about it. This is how minds work. So they're likely to constantly jump to conclusions and catastrophize. The knack is to try to notice more that when that's happening. When we notice it's happening, it may be helpful to tell ourselves that it is normal and it's unrealistic to try and stop it. There's nothing wrong with what's going on. It's not a sign that we're going mad or we're losing control, and it would be unrealistic to try and stop it. We can, however, spot it and spot it early. And if we do that, then we can consider two different approaches. We can either say consider an alternative perspective, or we can unhook from the thought and its meaning. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that now. Once we've done that, the key thing then is to reconsider how to behave. When we've jumped to a conclusion, or we're engaging or thinking catastrophically, and then we start to feel anxious, we're very likely to avoid or put things off or start behaving in ways which aren't helpful. So after we've spotted unhelpful thinking, it's usually a really good idea to notice what sort of behaviours go with it and try not to do it. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on. Okay, so two different ways then to manage unhelpful thinking patterns. So for both methods, the first step is to try to notice the thinking pattern. And the first sign that you'll probably get is a change in your mood. So if you start to feel anxious or guilty or angry, it's a good thing to do is try to notice, or try to ask yourself, what was I thinking just then, or what was I thinking just before? And generally, a really good rule of thumb is to write it down. And the next step might be to consider an alternative view. Now, to do that, a first step is to say, that's an example of me catastrophizing, or that's an example of mind reading. Now you might want to say that in your head, but if you're on your own, you might want to say that out loud. Now it might sound a bit strange, but it's giving your mind some feedback to actually spot this is a bias, this is a thinking pattern which may not be an accurate point of view. From there, you might want to come to an alternative perspective which is more helpful or maybe reflects the big picture. So for example, if the catastrophic thought stems from a noise that you've heard in the night and you've been worrying instantly that your house is getting burgled or someone's broken into your house, when you've checked it out and you've said to yourself, I think I might be catastrophizing, you might want to come to an alternative view, which is, perhaps the noise was generated by the wind and it's not a burglar. So this is one helpful method or tip which we do a lot of in cognitive behaviour therapy, which is spotting a thought, labelling the bias that you've spotted or the thinking pattern, in this case catastrophizing, and then trying to come to an alternative view which takes in more of the evidence. An alternative perspective and an alternative method that we use in cognitive therapy is called different things, but I'm going to call it unhooking from thoughts. Now, this goes something like, rather than perhaps trying to think about an alternative thought, is rather just notice that the thought is in fact a thought. So for example, if you're having a thought that, let's use the same example again, that your house is being burgled and you keep worrying about that, you can say to yourself, I'm noticing that I'm having a thought that my house has been burgled. So another example might be if you're approaching going down to the pub or to a cafe or to a church that afternoon, and you notice that you're having a thought, people are going to notice my new shirt, or people are going to think badly of me, and you've noticed that you're feeling anxious. To unhook from that thought, what might be useful is to say to yourself, I'm noticing that I'm having the thought that people will think badly of me. And by doing that, what you're doing is you're stepping back from your thought and looking at it for what it really is. It's a thought, and it may be true or it may be not true, but what may be useful is just to really notice that it is just a thought. Okay, so in summary, 2 techniques to help with thoughts that might lead to more worry. We can label our thinking. This is catastrophizing, this is overgeneralizing, and try to think of an alternative. Or we can notice our thoughts and say to ourselves, I'm having a thought that. So in this section, what we've been thinking about so far is how worry and dwelling can be made worse by thinking patterns or thinking biases which don't take in the big picture, and in doing so they can make situations seem more dangerous than they really are, which in turn makes us more anxious or worried, and then our thinking can become even more biased. But also in the second half of this section we've been looking at how by using these techniques you can break out of this cycle by spotting thinking biases, telling yourself, reminding yourself that this is a natural process that we can't really stop, and either trying to label the bias and come up with an alternative perspective, or unhook from the thought by simply saying to yourself, I'm noticing that, or I am thinking that X, Y and Z. Just like the tips and techniques mentioned previously, although they sound simple, they're bound to take some effort and practice to get the most of. And what I'd suggest you do is you practice this 2 or 3 times before you come to any conclusions about whether it's a method that will work for you. Right, so coming back to the vicious flower or the formulation, what we've covered so far is what worry is and what dwelling are, what anxiety is. We've looked at attention biases and how that can feed back to make us worry more. And in the last section we've looked at how thinking is also biased and can lead to worry. The last section we're going to look at today is this petal on the left hand side, this of how worry leads to avoidance and how avoidance can lead to more worry and dwelling. So avoidance is very common in all anxiety problems and depression, and it perhaps sums up maybe the most important idea, single idea to get our heads around in terms of our recovery from anxiety and depression. So a good thing to do now is, if you've got a pencil and paper, is just pause for a second and just write down all the ways that you can think of that either you avoid things or people in general avoid stuff when they get anxious or when they get low. Okay, so you've probably come up with quite a big list. It may have included things like not go to a meeting, not call the bank, drink alcohol, what other things may have come up with, dwell on things but not actually do them, put things off, all sorts of things that humans would generally do if they feel uncomfortable or anxious. We're more likely to avoid things. We're going to look at a clip next, and then we'll go on to think about and try to understand why do people tend to avoid stuff so much when they get anxious or low.
This morning I got up and got ready quickly because I had to get a lot of stuff done. I sat down at my desk to start getting my stuff done, and I spilled my coffee, so I got a sponge to clean it up, and I figured I'd take an extra minute to clean the whole desk because a clean desk would help me get my stuff done. When I was finished, I realized I hadn't eaten anything and I didn't want to be hungry while I got my stuff done, so I went into the kitchen and I was out of cereal. When I got to the grocery store, I remembered a bunch of other crap I needed to get, and I figured I was already there, so I did my shopping for the week so I didn't have to worry about it while I got my stuff done. When I got home, I didn't feel like cereal anymore, and so I made an omelet and I did the dishes so I wouldn't have to do them after I got my stuff done, and then I went out to get some oil from the hardware store because my desk chair is kind of squeaky and I didn't want to be distracted by a squeaky chair while I got my stuff done. When I got back, it was getting kind of late, and I knew I wouldn't be able to get my stuff done today, so I started watching the Twilight Zone marathon on TV. I just have to make sure I get to bed early because I want to be well rested tomorrow so I can get my stuff done.
In the clip, we saw a very common form of avoidance, but a subtle one where we procrastinate, we put things off. So although we're busying ourselves with lots of stuff, they're all part of a more complicated avoidance cycle where we're not actually doing the thing that might help us feel better or worry less. So why do we do this? Why do we often avoid too much? Well, one reason is because of the fight and flight system, that old brain system that we were talking about earlier on in the seminar, this better safe than sorry mechanism. Now what this leads to is forms of avoidance which are called safety seeking behaviours. So we see these as behaviours that people do in order to try to feel or actually be safe. Now this is the way as we discussed earlier, this is the way our brains are programmed to operate on a better safe than sorry basis. So it's almost like our brain is predisposed to avoid things as soon as we feel anxious or uncomfortable. Now another reason, in terms of understanding and perhaps being compassionate and kind to ourselves to understand why we avoid stuff, is it works. In the short time, if we avoid something or we put it off, we get a big sense of relief. So for example, if our anxiety is about having a panic attack, and the last panic attack we had was when we travelled on a bus, it's very understandable and very likely that rather than taking the bus to work, we might start taking a taxi or start walking. In that process of considering going on the bus and then changing our mind, we're going to get a big hit of relief. And humans love relief. So this is another reason to understand why we avoid too much or so much, is because in the short term we get a big hit of relief. So relief is habit forming. Once we start avoiding something once, because we get a hit of relief, we're likely to do it again, and once we do it again we get another hit of relief, and this becomes a habit where we do it again and again and again, and before we know it we're avoiding taking the bus to work completely. Now another way of understanding why human beings can get into patterns where they avoid things too much is because humans are very sensitive to and don't like uncertainty. And this, we're going to look a little bit more at uncertainty now. Now understanding uncertainty is usually important in terms of understanding most problems of anxiety and depression, but it's particularly important if the problem that you want to work on in therapy includes excessive worry or obsessive or compulsive patterns of behaviour. So let's look a bit more at uncertainty. Now the world is full of uncertainty. It's all around us. Every day, every moment of our day is surrounded by some things which are uncertain. Now what we know about people who worry excessively is that they tend to have a lower tolerance for uncertainty than those who don't. People who have a lower tolerance for uncertainty will try harder to be certain or avoid certainty by either worrying more or seeking certainty more intently. So for example, if someone worries excessively about their health, they're more likely to seek certainty more than others about that. So for example, if we worry excessively about our health, we may present to our GP much more than other people. We may ask other people if we look okay, or if a certain emotion or a certain feeling is normal. So which of these do you do too much? Let's go through them one by one. Not giving jobs or tasks to others as you need to do it yourself. Looking for too much information before going ahead with things. So maybe spending hours researching something and going through all the different options before making a decision where it's really not that necessary. It may not make that much difference at all. As soon as you've made a decision, you might start questioning all over again to try to be absolutely sure that the decision you've made is the right one. Looking for reassurance too much from other people. You know, does this dress look alright? Perhaps going through a whole different amount of clothes before deciding what to wear before you go out. Or perhaps seeking reassurance after you've cooked a meal that it tasted okay. Seeking reassurance is very common and can show up in all different parts of our lives. Not fully committing to things. So perhaps you have an opportunity and someone asks you to do something, but because you feel unsure about it, because you feel uncertain, rather than saying yes straight away, you put it off, and you put it off repetitively. Maybe, not so sure. You might find yourself finding imaginary reasons for not doing things. Things which you know in your heart of hearts aren't real reasons, but you use these to tell yourself these are why you don't want to do it. Because you're unsure whether it'll go well, for example. Generally putting things off, like we saw in the video. Doing things for other people rather than doing it yourself. Or rather, doing things for other people rather than allowing other people to do things for you. And finally, really common one, checking and doing things over and over because you're not 100% sure you did it correctly. So for example, you leave the house and you think you've locked the door, but as soon as you've walked away you start to feel unsure that it's locked. So you go back and you check, and you may check loads and loads of times before you feel sure enough that the door's locked. All these things are typical sorts of things that people do excessively when they worry. So what's the problem? Why should these things be a problem? Again, if you've got a pencil and paper, just write down your own ideas. Maybe this might apply to you, but you might think more generally how it applies to people in general. Why might avoiding things in this way, or in all the ways that we've covered so far, how might this be problematic and make the situation worse? Okay, so here's a list that we've come up with. It may be different from, or it may overlap with the sorts of things that you've been thinking of. Avoiding things directly or indirectly leads to more worry and rumination. It does this by, for example, extending the worry period. So if you put something off before acting on it, the period over which you might worry that it might go wrong or it won't go well is naturally extended, which means you're going to be doing a lot more worry over a much longer period. If we worry and then put things off, it prevents us from finding out how the world really is. Now this is a key idea in cognitive behaviour therapy, and at some point during your therapy your therapist is very likely to encourage you to do something called a behavioural experiment. An experiment where you experiment with not avoiding something, all in the service of finding out what really happens or finding out how the world really is. This is important and can be problematic if we're not finding out how the world really is, because we end up living in a world which might actually be in our minds a lot more dangerous than it really is. And another reason why avoidance is unhelpful and can lead to a very poor sense of well-being through excessive anxiety or depression is it leads to a life which is more focused on seeking relief but less focused on seeking reward. So we end up doing less of the things which genuinely make us feel vital or satisfied. And overall, because we're spending so much time checking or seeking reassurance or putting things off, life starts to feel less fulfilling. Life starts to matter less. And when this happens, we miss out, we get low, and we get self-critical, and we're at risk of getting depressed. So the key message then about avoidance is that it's very understandable, but often makes us feel less confident, worry more, and over a long period. Now, I've underlined very understandable because it really is very understandable. Now, if we really take on board that it is understandable because it's relief forming, because it forms habits, then that's more likely for us to be kind and compassionate toward ourselves, and less likely to be really self-critical or sort of put the boot in, if you like. So key messages are that avoidance is very understandable, but it makes us feel less confident and worry more over a longer period. We do it because we hate to be uncertain. Tips for coping then. Let's look at that now. One idea is to be honest with yourself. Is this working? So most people on reflection are aware of when they're avoiding, and they're also somewhat aware that although the temptation and the urge to avoid is very strong because of this habit forming relief that we get, is try to be honest with yourself. Is this working? Ask yourself this question. Try to feel the fear, but do it anyway. Now, if you've been in a habit of avoiding or putting things off for a long time, even if the thing that you're worrying about isn't as dangerous as your thoughts or your attention makes it out to be, when you start approaching the thing that you've been avoiding, it's very likely that you're going to feel uncomfortable. So if you apply the principle of feel the fear and do it anyway, if you're doing well, it's important to plan to feel uncomfortable and uncertain in the first instance. It's very unlikely that in the first instance you'll feel that same sense of relief straight away, but after you've repeated it 3 or 4 times, it's very likely that you'll start to settle down and feel more comfortable again. Evaluate only afterwards. So if you are planning to reverse some avoidances, is what our minds will tend to do is they'll tend to lead us toward evaluating what's going to happen before we do it rather than afterwards. So if I've got in the habit of going to the gym because I've been feeling really low, it's likely that as I approach getting my kit together, I'm likely to start thinking, I can't be bothered, or I'd much rather watch telly, or I'm too tired. However, if we label those thoughts as thoughts, go to the gym and then ask ourselves afterwards whether it was worth going, it's much more likely that we'll come up with a more positive conclusion. Evaluating only afterwards is key and helps us to sort of get round that voice or the thoughts of our mind, which are much more likely to lead to deviation or putting things off further. If you have been putting things off for a long time, it's likely that there's a list of things that you avoid. It might be very useful to write down almost everything that you've been putting off and order them into shallow end and deep end. And what I mean by that is, at the deep end is the things that make you feel the most anxious or the most uncomfortable to get back on track with or start facing up to. But at the bottom, at the shallow end, you might find things which actually, although they do make you feel anxious, don't make you feel nearly as anxious. So it may be better to start with those things first. So what we've covered there is 4 tips or techniques to help break out of this cycle of worry and dwelling, leading to avoidance and then making the problem worse. Once again, none of the techniques are considered to be easy to get up and running, and it'll take effort and practice, but it may be that there's just one of those which you feel able to practice and try 2 or 3 times to see if you can get up and running. So as we come toward the end of this seminar, let's just touch base with the whole vicious flower or formulation again. So in summary, what we've talked about so far is in the middle of this vicious flower of what maintains worry is this process of how worry leads to anxiety, and anxiety leads to more worry. Or in the case of dwelling, how dwelling on things, especially when we're depressed, can lead to further depressed mood or guilt or shame, which in turn can really get us stuck in our heads. What we've moved on to in the second half of the seminar is looking at 3 other processes which can go on to keep worry going longer than is necessary. We've looked at thinking and thinking biases. We've looked at attention and attention biases, and we've looked at avoidance. And across those 3 areas, in each area we've covered a few tips or techniques for you to experiment with and see if they help break out of these cycles that keep your low mood or keep your anxiety going. And again, all those are listed in great detail, or enough detail, in the pack. So that's the end of the seminar. Thanks for listening. If this is the first seminar that you've listened to, you might want to try the other 2 seminars. If you found this seminar useful, it might be a good idea to listen to it again, or find the bit in the seminar that you found interesting or useful and maybe listen to that a few more times. I hope you find it useful, and good luck with your CBT.